Hello, everyone, and welcome to Books to Africa on Air, where we discuss interesting topics with a special focus on Africa. My name is Tonson Sango, and I'm your host today. And I'm discussing with Hilary Rouse-Amadi, who is a very good supporter of Books to Africa, as well as a well-established author. She's written this wonderful book here called Crossing Borders, amongst many. And I wanted to talk about her book, as well as other issues of her expertise, English literature, African women. She spent a lot of time in Africa, so I'm really looking forward to having the chat. So welcome, Hilary.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Glad to be here.
Yeah, welcome. We've been saying we'll have this interview for a while, and we're finally having it. So anyway, how are you feeling? Your book, Crossing Borders, is finally out.
It is indeed.
And it seems it's a mixture of all kinds of things. It seems almost like a collage of your whole life, your multicultural experience. So maybe tell us about that. I mean, how did you get to travel the world? And, you have worked in Africa, lived in Africa, from Scotland. I mean, how did it all come together into this book?
Well, I think the most important point is the interconnections between peoples and cultures. And I make a clear statement about this on the back of my book with reference to the late Joe Cox, who said that, yes, there are differences between cultures, but we all have a lot in common. And if we can focus on this, and if we can also learn from each other, then the world, I think, could be a much happier place. But I had a rather collage-type childhood myself. Mother, Lancastrian from the north of England, father, lowland Scot, and I had, between the ages of 8 and 10 and a half, 2.5 years in South America, in Buenos Aires.
Wow.
And then back to Scotland, and I suffered from culture shock because I had been strongly influenced by the absorption of certain aspects of Argentinian culture, because at that time, if you were an expat, if you were an expatriate, you could attend a US school or a British school, which I did, but you also, by law, had to follow the Argentinian syllabus and curriculum. So it was like having 2 school days in one.
Wow.
And so I would go home praising Evita Perón, and my mother, oh, what's all this? So from very early days, I had been crossing cultures, as it were.
Wow.
And my first husband did a degree in anthropology and sociology and did research in Zambia. And so I spent best part of 4 years in Zambia, where my first child was born in Lusaka, the university
And
teaching
your late husband,
hospital.
is that, just for those who don't know who he is?
The second husband.
The second husband,
Yes,
okay. Yeah, because, your son in Rouse-Amadi, I was going to ask you about Elechi Amadi, who,
Yes.
at some point was your partner.
Yes, indeed, indeed.
How did you guys, because, you went to, Southern America and, England. I mean, where did you meet Elechi and, how did you...
Well, it's very, very curious. When I was teaching at Ahmadu Bello University, Zaria, in the north, I had been, northern Nigeria, I had been writing an article for a conference at the University of Ibadan. And it was quite a critical analysis of Elechi's first novel, The Concubine.
The Concubine.
And this stirred quite a lot of controversy, and we had a lot of really lively debate at UI. And when I went back to Port Harcourt as head of the English department at the River State College of Education, one of my colleagues said, well, Hilary, you have to give Elechi a copy of that paper. And I said, well, I'm not sure how he would respond, but you have to, morally, ethically, you must.
And was it a critical, were you kind of critical of his work?
Yes,
or
I
were
was.
You praising him? Okay.
I would say very well written, but I said he wasn't doing justice to Ikwere women. And it was a gender politics analysis, and I was taking him to task.
So what was the problem? Was it that he was portraying Ikwere women as what, being...
Well,
promiscuous or
no, nothing like that. It just seemed to me that the women were very peripheral to the men in the presentation of family life, society, etc., which was something that I also found in other African writers, and as a woman, very interested in how Nigerian women, well, especially in the southeast, the different traditional organizations that empower women, all of this was left out. Why? Well, of course, my answer as a woman, the patriarchy. Anyway, Elechi came to the house, and I said, yes, I've got a copy for you. And he read it, and he came back, and he said, very well written, but I disagree with most of what you say. And we just both burst out laughing. And that was the start of what one would call a very dialectical relationship. We had a series of broadcasts on River State Radio discussing the relationship between literature and society, and we took very different approaches. But people enjoyed the discussion, very lively.
Wow! So it seems to be you're very kind of fundamentally different. Would you say about your views on things like gender and the role of women?
Gender politics was a
and yet you were married, and yet you stayed together.
Well, but we had a lot in common as well. I loved the fact that this was a man who was a major public figure, but lived very simply. He completely hated all this big man nonsense of big cars and
big houses,
status, and I also loved his commitment to his village Alu. I mean, this was absolutely wonderful. I wrote a poem recently, and I prefaced it with a comment. You can take this man out of his village, but you cannot ever take Alu out of Elechi. So, and I also, he was respected as a man of integrity whom you could not bribe.
Right.
And
that's very important.
And this was fantastic. This was something I really, really appreciated. So there were areas of great difference, but there were areas of great mutual respect and understanding. Right. And I think it was also something he appreciated, being able to talk. And I never asked questions because one should not be intrusive. But he talked about some of his experiences during the Civil War, when in fact, his life was in danger. And the thing he said, when he wrote Sunset in Biafra, there was a lot that he just missed out because it was too painful.
Wow.
So this was a man who had experienced a lot, and also I absolutely admired his many, many skills and areas of expertise. When he was a schoolboy at Umuahia Government College, he saw these people playing piano. He thought, I think I'd like to do... He taught himself to play piano.
Wow. And at a grown-up age,
No, this is a secondary school boy.
Secondary school boy. Okay.
He taught himself to play piano. So he had a great appreciation of many types of African music, but also a great appreciation of certain Western classical traditions.
Wow.
So when he said, Hilary, can I bring my piano into your house? I thought, things are getting serious here.
and that's, just touching on that, I think a lot of people, because what you're describing is kind of an amalgamation of different cultures coexisting, not just in the same space, but in marriage, in relationship. And I think do you feel like we're losing that today? There's a bit of kind of segmentation and people trying to say, well, if you're not of this community or if you're not of this country, then, or if you're from a different culture, then somehow you shouldn't belong here, you shouldn't be around.
Which is absolutely, in my opinion, absolutely hopeless, because if you look at the situation in Britain today, if this dreadful Brexit goes through, what am I supposed to do? Cut myself in half because I'm half Scottish and I'm half English. So, this business of crossing borders, connecting, but coming to terms with differences. We have to, the late, great Andrea Levy, who, whose work is wonderful. I mean, I love her novel Small Island, and of course it was televised, made into a film.
Yeah.
And she made this point that when she writes, she doesn't write, or when she wrote, we now have to say, she said in an interview, I didn't write with the express idea of changing minds, but with the idea of opening minds. And that's beautiful.
Wow.
Or
opening minds.
Or you think of the wonderful Mexican director Alfonso Cuarón, who directed this fantastic film Roma. And he talks about interconnections. We are all interconnected. And so I share this perspective with Alfonso Cuarón and with the late, great Andrea Levy, who is one of the great British writers of her time.
Yeah. I was going to ask you because, I mean, I know, when you think about, for example, the fact that you've had a very kind of multicultural, you've been exposed, you've traveled the world, you've worked in different countries. Do you think that contributes to your perspective about kind of, being open-minded when it comes to cultures, rather than, for example, somebody who's never traveled and never left home and never left their community? Do you think it matters to go abroad to experience other countries, other cultures?
I think if the opportunity is there, it should be taken and explored, because when you are exploring with respect another culture, you also put the culture into which you were born and in which you grew up, you put it into a broader perspective.
Right.
So I can appreciate things about the cultures I was privileged to peripherally explore in Nigeria, but they also allowed me to look at my own background, my own heritage from a broader perspective. And that again is an aspect of interconnections.
And talking about women, because you said, for example, when you wrote a critique of Elechi's book and, about the gender aspect of it. What did you find living amongst African women in the Niger Delta with the Equerry women? And I know you got involved a lot with kind of organizing and so on. What would you say about women that perhaps we have lost today, those African women? I mean, in terms of how empowered they were, in terms of how they saw themselves, and also in terms of kind of the Me Too movement and what's going on today. I mean, how do you see that being from that perspective, from kind of like an African woman's or African experience, that you've had?
Well, again, I just learnt so much, and the reason when I came back to Britain in the late 85, I wanted to share what I had learnt in terms of the way in which the Ikwere and Igbo women with whom I interacted, the traditions they had to organize and to defend basic human rights, and also put pressure within the patriarchy on men when certain red lines were crossed. And those powers were strong and respected and deeply embedded in the communities, in their communities. And so I thought, wow, this is something that European women can learn from. And the solidarity that women express and feel, and how that is translated into political activism that is part of traditions.
Wow.
Of course, the patriarchal structure is there, but the worst insult traditionally in many parts of the southeast of Nigeria, the worst insult is if a woman who she has to be really, really angry with a man. He has to seriously transgress. The worst insult she can give is to curse him by the breasts that have fed children. And that traditionally, because again, respect for women in their procreative roles, combined with respect for women as farmers, as traders. And when the Brits arrived, with their colonizing confusion, and they went to a market. Now, we want to talk to your head man here. Well, in many markets in the southeast, there was no such thing as a head man. It was the Ezewai, the queen of the market, the woman. Well, I mean, your Victorians and Edwardians, what?
So in a sense, that was actually, something of a shock to the Britons.
Well, they didn't really take it on board. They there was this because of a racist sense of a false sense of superiority. So there wasn't what I have been talking about: an open mind, interconnections, learning from each other. So.
And I know you did some teaching as well in Africa, in Zambia, and in Nigeria. Teaching English and literature. So, I mean, would you say, for example, as a teacher, I mean, how did you find it that you're this white woman, to use the word, in Nigeria teaching black students, about literature? I mean, what was that like? Was there any kind of gender discrimination towards you, or did they say, "Oh, look at this white woman coming here"?
The curious thing is, before I went to Zambia, I remember in a cafe in a small town in Lancashire, because I'd gone with my first husband to say goodbye to my mother, my sister, and this lass who was a waitress, and she said, you're going to that, and it was the kind of dark continent idea. And I just looked at Tony, my first husband, and we just looked at each other and we laughed. We thought, well, And when I arrived in Zambia, it was extraordinary. I was in the early stages of pregnancy.
Really?
I had my first...
A lot of people would not be pregnant with going to Africa.
I had my first teaching. Well,
Malaria.
we didn't tell Tony's parents because we thought they might
worried.
they might be a bit concerned. And I had my first teaching job, and I was asked to put a program of English studies together. This was in the Natural Resources Development College, and I was mostly dealing with agricultural education students. So I thought, well, hang on, I'm not going to give them British literature. That would be absurd. So I tried to keep a few steps ahead of my students. It was South African literature. Of course, Zambia was a frontline state when I lived there in the 70s. So it was South African writers, wonderful writers, responding to the horrors of apartheid. And yes, this is what I was teaching. And then I discovered the galaxy of stars from Nigeria. And I was reading Achebe, Soyinka, etc. And then the Francophone, wow! Usman Sambel and all these wonderful writers, and so I was keeping a few steps ahead of my students, and we had a ball. We had a wonderful time.
So I guess that was your secret, in a sense, teaching local content to local.
Well, you teach what your students can connect with. Again, going back to interconnections, that's not to say that there isn't a place for writers from other cultures, but look at what is on your own homegrown patch and related countries and cultures first. Wow. That was That was my thinking. And I'd sort of got a little bit, I'd fallen out of love with some of the courses that I had studied at university when I was doing a literature degree. And so it was, in fact, African writers who rekindled my love of literature and teaching. Yeah.
Wow. Wow. That's a big statement.
And I think also because, when I read, when I was reading Achebe, learning about the history of imperialism and colonialism, I could relate as a woman who was also very concerned that women have to deal with the patriarchy. So that was a link, you see. I could understand the struggle against imperialism, the struggle against racism, because I was also very concerned with issues affecting women, and that is again a worldwide, a global struggle.
Absolutely, and I mean you've done quite a lot of work. We can't possibly go through all of the things, all of the interesting stories. But I mean, talking about your book, Crossing Borders, in a sense, what I want to ask you 2 questions, and maybe you can read maybe a short poem, from your book, just to give people who are watching a taster of what kind of poems are in the book.
Yeah.
But one question is, would you say that Crossing Borders, in a sense, was you trying to bring all of your experiences of these different cultures and kind of bringing them all into this one book, one collection where you can kind of reflect on different topics that are not clearly related in any way, but they're kind of contemporary issues happening around us or contemporary discussions. That's one question. So is it kind of an amalgamation of all of that? And is that why you chose to do poems as opposed to writing a novel, for example, about your life and what you've been through? Why poetry rather than prose, for example? And then answer those 2 questions, and then you can read a section from a short poem, and then
Okay. Well, this idea of an amalgamation, I think the collection deals with social, economic, and political issues of our time. And again, going back to this word that I've used so often, interconnections. Interconnections. So, yes, when we look, for instance, at the confusion at present in Britain, and the idea that if things take a certain pattern, there is a possibility that Scotland may become separate and independent. Well, I have Nigerian friends who also from the southeast have an idea that they would like a certain independence.
The Biafra.
Yes, the indigenous people of Biafra, IPOB. And these, the problems are similar. The problems are similar. The responses also are similar. And again, I would emphasize the importance of connections. Because, yes, it's a complicated history, the history of the relations between Scotland and England. And I know because of my own family history. But for goodness sake, we've got far more in common than that which separates us and makes us different. And when it comes to Nigeria, and when one looks at the tragedy in the past of the Civil War, I can see it from both sides because I'm an outsider. Elechi, obviously, federalist, but I had friends who had a different interpretation and felt that, yes, Igbo people had the right, especially with regard to recent history, and that this was should be accepted.
The best way forward.
Yes, so I could see there were arguments. There were arguments on both sides, but, and I think this is where Elechi's objectivity came in, regarding the politics of Nigeria as a whole, which are difficult and challenging, as long as the economy depends fundamentally on oil, there is no way that the other parts of Nigeria, particularly the north, is going to allow
a succession.
Yes. Yeah. And therefore, you don't, in my opinion, you don't go into a struggle if really you don't have a hope of success. Because we know that in the Nigerian Civil War, over 1 million died. And the suffering was very terrible.
Yeah.
And I remember Elechi actually saying to me, he said, so you, as a student, you were collecting money to support Biafra? I said, yes, because Achebe did a fantastic, and others did a fantastic job of propaganda, I mean, sophisticated propaganda, and there were coherent arguments presented. And he said, well, people like you actually helped to prolong the suffering.
Wow.
And I thought, but he didn't say it in a malicious way. He said, because the bigger picture,
the battle was never going to be won.
Picture was clear. Yeah. It was not going to happen. And so, when you are dealing with complexity, yes, there can be arguments on different sides, but there needs to be a comprehensive understanding and a long-term understanding.
And why poetry?
Yes, of course, why poetry? Well,
very quickly.
I've always from time to time written poems as academic articles as well. But if you are suffering from, if you come back to Britain with a bouncing baby boy and you're also suffering from recurrent malaria, and you're also trying to pay the mortgage, and you're also trying to do some teaching, and your head is full of information which you wanted to produce in book form as a study, but you don't have the time and energy to do that. So in poetry, you can say a lot in a few words. It's concentrated.
Right.
And so that's
beautiful. That's a good way to say
that's how it happened.
Okay,
really.
So have a look at that camera there. Select maybe a short poem, concentrated one, and read it into the camera, just to give us an idea of kind of what the flavor is.
Again, I do touch on 35 countries. In fact, more than 35, but. Since we've been talking about, African issues in Nigeria, it's obviously appropriate to choose a Nigerian context poem. The context is northern Nigeria, Bauchi State, Zaria Kaduna State. These are the areas that are relevant. The graduate. When her father refused her permission to attend secondary school, she sold her favorite wrapper to pay for the bus ride that would take her far from relations and friends, village and home, alone, unprotected, unaided, save for the scholarship award nestling moist in the safe, secret hollow between her breasts. When her husband refused her permission to sit for jam, she bit her lip, registered in silence unobserved, while her womb growled unwelcome warnings that her second baby might make a first impromptu appearance on the examination room floor. When her husband ordered her to stay at home and mind her children and house like a proper wife should, she uttered no sound of reproach or complaint, just packed her bags, rented a room in Samaru, and called for her mother to come and carry her baby while she joined her classmates in crowded lecture rooms. Her husband decided not to repudiate his pretty wife, transferred to Zaria, and lowered the level of domestic strife. When the clamour of their children and his visiting nieces and nephews laid siege subversive to her studies, she carried her books stealthily to the quarters at the back and resolutely prepared her long research essay by kerosene lamp, the maid from her village, loyal, supportive, sworn to secrecy. Now, her framed photograph hangs next to his, trophy to her tactful persistence. In her graduation gown, she smiles, modest and demure, yet insistent, unashamedly sure of the success she has won in her guerrière campaign, one long battle braved in a series only just begun, as she looks for a way to send her young maid to school. Out of the late harmattan chill, change unexpected is on its way. On reflection, her husband's scowling misgivings transform into smiles of self-congratulation. He is glad for having sensibly conceded to his dear wife's dogged determination to scale the walls of academic achievement. For now, he can take his sabbatical in the USA and leave her with the children to maintain the home and pay for her needs and theirs from her salary alone.
Wow.
I'm having a little fun, but I'm making a very serious point.
Very serious point. I think we got the point there, which is, even though he was opposed to higher education in the beginning, in the end it was beneficial.
He benefited,
and he was proud.
He was proud. He actually was proud of his wife.
And one thing that also hit me when you were reading that is the fact that she didn't actually protest when he was trying to stop her, but she just went ahead and did what she wanted to do.
Well, this is a northern Nigerian woman with immense calm and dignity, and thinking to herself, direct confrontation will get me nowhere and will harm the children. So let me
find another
way and leave doors open. And sometimes confrontation cannot be avoided, but it is best avoided.
I think that's amazing. I mean, look, Crossing Borders, guys, all of you should go out there. This book is amazing. I mean, just like the poem she just read, there's a lot more in there. So please go out there, go on Amazon, go on anywhere books are sold. On Hilary's website as well, you can get this book and enjoy the lovely poems in there. I really enjoyed that. You have other books that might be coming out soon. We're talking about doing Amina and other things.
Yes.
And I think the poem you just read about the importance of education, I mean, what would you say in closing in terms of the value of education for women?
Well, aren't there various sayings on the African continent that when you educate a man, you educate an individual, but when you educate a woman, you educate possibly a whole community.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that's so true.
And there are so many wonderful, wonderful role models from the African continent, women of astounding talent, bravery, diplomacy, courage, and I do try to honor them in the poems I have written and the notes, accompanying the poems. So I've given references so people can go and find out about Wangari Maathai, for example, and the Green Belt movement, and the wonderful, wonderful women who are role models for all of us.
Absolutely.
For Europeans, for
Americans,
people all over.
That is great. Thank you very much, Hilary. So guys, thank you very much for watching today. I hope you support us, support Hilary, get her book, and of course this is Books to Africa on Air, bringing you the wonderful, amazing authors such as Hilary today. Do join us for the next episode next time.
Every day, millions of good books are thrown away. Yet 50% of people who go to school in Africa will not be able to read or write properly because they have no books. Books to Africa collects donated books and send them to projects in Africa. You can donate your books, fund a container shipment to Africa, or become a dedicated sponsor. Please do not throw your books away. Go to www.bookstoafrica.org to get involved. Thank you.